Thanks, David. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to welcome everybody and say hello. It's great. Well, I guess right now I'm just seeing your names, but it's too bad we're not in person. Michelle and I are looking forward to going through some great discussions today. Next slide. And I'm going to go through some of the preamble pretty quick so that we can spend most of our time with Michelle on some updates and then the presenters. We have some great presenters, as you see here. Much of today's discussion is a continuation of the May discussion, updates on some critical topics that we talked about then, as well as kind of discussion about moving forward. Next slide. As you can see on this agenda, Michelle is going to take 10, 12 minutes for an NIH update. A little bit more, maybe a little bit less based on the chat and the questions, but feel free to jump in with any questions. And then, as I said, we'll have discussions that were initiated a long time ago, but we discussed in the May meeting. And then we'll spend most of the time on data access, sharing, and management. And as we talked about in May, we want to emphasize that this is a costing perspective because this is the Finance, Audit, and Costing Committee. So there's lots of issues related to data management and sharing that Michelle, Melissa, and I will talk about, but or that in general that out there, but we're going to focus on the costing, like how it's paid for, and we'll discuss those issues. Next slide. So now turning it over to Michelle Bowles to say hello and to talk about whatever she wants to talk about.
Thank you, Jim, and hello, everyone. I am so glad to be here with you today, just to share a few updates for the Costing Committee. First and foremost, I hope that everyone is safe and sound, and I hope everyone is in good spirits. And as we share the update, a few areas of the update, I'm going to start off with like the really good stuff, fun stuff, and then we'll get into some of the more weightier issues. But then I'm going to remind you of all the good things that I told you about at the beginning of this discussion so we can leave on a happy note. So I hope everyone appreciates that. So as you know, we have within this committee been talking about the federal cash transaction report elimination, and we are pleased to still announce that that is looking good. We're looking at having the SCTR elimination by the second quarter of FY22. They are on track for doing so. NIH is looking at their working with our accountants, as well as working with the accountants across HHS. At the department level, we've gotten so much support from the DAS there. Alice Bettencourt, she has really been open and transparent about the elimination. She's worked with OPRA within NIH to vet some of the language. And so we are really excited to say that that is well underway. We will be meeting up in another few weeks just to continue to look at some of the accounting policies, making sure that the reporting is submitted timely and making sure that the advances are removed and that the drawdowns are at that expenditure level. So we are really excited about that. I have a team of my folks working with HHS and with the Office of Financial Management and our MBS system to make sure that we are all in lock and step so that we can definitely get that going. Jim, I see your hand is up.
It's a virtual clap, Michelle. It wasn't a hand up. It was clapping.
It was a
clapping.
This
is great news.
Yeah, I'm really excited.
This is great news.
I am so
Wonderful.
excited. This is the time that I should probably be thinking about retiring, guys, because I feel like when I first came back to NIH, remember that, Jim, like it's been over 15 years where we've been working on trying to get the federal cash transaction report eliminated. And so we are in a good space and everyone is on board. NIH leadership supports it and has always supported it, but mainly the support that we're getting from the department level, both at the CFO level and at the grants administration level, is just tremendously encouraging. And so I'm just excited about that. Another area, so while we're on federal, on the federal financial report, I just wanted to acknowledge that we know that we have a lot more work to do in the area of these FFR challenges and the single submission and the single reinventing grants management solution through submitting your FFRs into the payment management system. So much so that we've had some discussions with our ERA colleagues as well as our colleagues downtown to determine whether or not we need to think about opening up the ERA FFR portal again to handle some of these one-off and very dicey situations, because we don't know that there's going to be a quick solution. So we are looking at that option because we really want to make sure that that the trains stay on the track. And we know that there has just been a plethora of challenges that we've experienced and that you guys have experienced. And so we are looking at the option of opening up the ERA FFR portal again and allowing those to come, certain types to come through when we can't get them into the payment management system. So we did address converting the final reports to interim, and we relaxed the validations and worked with PMS on that. So that helped in that area. We are looking at a process for reopening closed payment management system accounts to allow for FFR submissions. And we also addressed the fact that we have FFRs that have where we have FFRs that have more than 10 F&A rates. We are looking at trying to, and these are the ones that were submitted to ERA prior to that January 1st single solution policy. We're looking at the fact that PMS has told us that they are going to have to reject those and that they have to be resubmitted via PMS. So we won't be able to take them in and leave them in from the ERA perspective, but they'll have to be resubmitted via the payment management system. And some of the FFRs submitted now with more than 10 rates will need to, of course, we provided instructions to our recipients on the fact that that there needed to be that language in the remarks section in item 12. So we've tried to really work with PMS. We've tried to work with our recipients. We've heard and seen firsthand the administrative burden that this has placed on our recipients. And so we really, really want to try to, as much as we can, try to figure out whether or not there's a need to reopen that ERA portal and allow for us to be able to help you get these FFRs in. The thing that we don't want to do is create audits all over the place for you guys or cause you to be non-compliant with our terms and conditions because the system can't accept it. And so we recognize it. I am very engaged in talking to my team, talking to PMS, asking questions. And finally, we've made some really sound decisions here where we're really going to be, we're exploring the option of opening that ERA portal back up. So the area that we are still working through that has become a larger than life challenge for us and for you, I believe, are these $0 FFRs. And these are most commonly done when we're deobligating all the remaining funds to proceed with a change of institution. And sometimes it happens when we have an 100% offset. And I will say that we've reached out to PMS with a proposed solution on how to allow for these FFRs to be submitted. And I'm looking at possibly issuing a memo approving acceptance of this group of FFRs. One of the things that I do know that PMS has stated that maybe we might want to reconsider the way we are issuing the change of institutions and waiting for the relinquishing statement and the amounts that the old institution will be relinquishing and then processing the change of institution. We don't know how that would look for us. I mean, that might work early in the fiscal year, but at the end of the fiscal year, we don't know how that would look. And we don't want to put our system processes in a situation where it causes a huge problem for your faculty. So we will look at that, we will consider it, but the main challenge I think we need to do is to just issue some sort of memo allowing for them to accept it and see if that will help, at least short term. And I'm looking, Jim, are you monitoring the chat just to see if we have any questions?
I am. It does not appear that we have any, which I think is a good thing.
I do too. And I don't want you making trouble, so we're going to keep going. Oh, okay. Michelle, is the eliminate? Wait a minute. What does that say, Jim? It popped off my screen that quick.
Is the elimination of the SCTR for all HHS or just NIH?
Oh, it's for all of HHS. Yes, I meant to add that to my talking point because you asked me that question as well, Jim. And yes, that's going to be applicable to all of the HHS operating divisions. And so this is, it really impacted NIH. And NIH kind of stirred the pot, but it has worked out for everyone. I know. Yay. Yes, Lisa. Exciting. Okay. The next update is I'm going to talk to you guys about the process for requesting drawdowns outside of the 120-day liquidation period. I know that we had updated that process back in July. And I just wanted to remind you guys that these, the process and the circumstances by which we are using, really, we're trying to make sure that we don't put ourselves at an audit risk. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that as well as you. So what we are doing is the recipients are expected to request the payments. Of course, that's the policy within a 120-day liquidation period. There are circumstances where the recipients are unable to complete these drawdowns in a timely manner, and we do know about that. Someone asked about non-HHS agencies. I don't know other agencies that work with PMS. The only thing that I can speak to are the HHS agencies, and you'll have to contact the others for that information. But if there are PMS, if they work with PMS, that's likely going to impact them as well. Because PMS won't be accepting any more federal, the cash transaction reports. But anyways, so what we've identified is that in such cases where the recipient, second quarter of FY22, that's the targeted date for the elimination, and NIH will, of course, put things out in the NIH guide, because we're going to have to update the grants policy statement as well. No problem, Nancy. Thank you for asking. All right.
So Michelle, that means you'll be formally announcing it at some point to give us some lead time.
Oh,
if there's internal change management. So okay, great.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna I'm gonna be talking to the leadership at HHS to and I have a one-on-one tomorrow, and so I will ask that question just because I do know you guys need lead time.
And we're happy to help. FCP is happy to help. So if you need some input from institutions, let us know.
Okay, I think we'll be fine, to be quite honest with you. Okay. All right, so I'm adding that to my one-on-one. All right, so the recipients are expected to request payments within the 120-day liquidation period. There are circumstances where the recipient is unable to do that, and we know that that is the case. Although I'm going to remind you guys that, remember when we sat down, Jim, I don't know if you remember this, but you probably do, sat down in my office probably about 7 years ago, maybe, where we talked about the fact that, we needed more than 90 days. And then you guys convinced me that 120 days was what we needed because of all of the subcontracts and some other circumstances. We got 120 days, and now we're still saying the scope free.
But here's why, Michelle. I mean, the practical circumstance, and Joe's asking, right? Joe Ginhart from WashU. So we subbed to Joe Ginhart, he does a late invoice. Our PI is not happy with the performance at Washington University. We go back and forth, and 120 days triggers by. We eventually get happy with their work. We're ready to pay the invoice, and we want to draw it down, right? I mean, that is an example that you don't want us to certainly pay that invoice until we're happy with the research, and that could cause some extra time. It's exceptional, but it could happen.
It is exceptional. It could happen, but I think it's best to notify your ICs early so that you don't get to the 120 days, right? And then we have to approve it. That's something that could be handled early and often. So someone said that PMS is cutting them off at 90 days. I don't believe that is the case for NIH. And if it is the case for NIH, we would like to know about it, because 120 days is the timeline by which we have approved, and that PMS has assured us that they are doing. Now, anything beyond that, it does cut off, and then there needs to be approval. Then we have to go back and alert PMS to allow for the additional time. The IC typically reviews the request, that first request, and they determine whether the justification is adequate. And most often they do allow for it because they know that these are exigent circumstances. But once it's approved, the recipient will submit the payment request in PMS, and then NIH will notify PMS of the approval and the payments process. The thing that I wanted to remind you guys of is that the IC will approve the first request for an award, but if there's a second request received, then it has to be bumped up to the to OPRA OER for review and approval. Because at that point, then we're looking at something where we might have to request a class or a deviation from HHS. And then, of course, we coordinate with the ICs to process these approvals and then as they're received from PMS. So we're always aware of the requests because we're trying to monitor them, even the first request, but that second request will just amps it up to another approval level. And I will say that the chief GMOs at the IC level are very understanding. They very much understand that when a request comes in, that it does need to be exigent circumstances, and they do review them. And most of them, I believe, have been approved. And if there are some that have not been, I do trust the judgment of those IC chiefs. They are very understanding with our recipients and very much partners and collaborators, just as OPRA is as well. So I know we have a lot of questions in the chat. So do we want to go through those, Jim?
Do a couple of them. I mean, do you have other things to cover? I think this is really good discussion. There's a lot of interest. So probably a couple of more minutes on this. Okay.
So can we draw down on 120, paid on 121, or does it get turned off at 120? It gets turned off at 120. As far as
coordinate early.
Coordinate early, and then that will be helpful. As far as the outside, outside the liquidation period issues, we are having trouble with PMS and NIH communicating with each other. We have approval from the agency, but they cannot seem to get it correct with PMS to release the funds. I don't know if this is the case all the way around, or if this is a instance. I do know that we have worked very hard to continue to communicate with PMS. So if this is truly a challenge, it would be good to know about it, because we have meetings with them every Monday or Tuesday, and my team is on the meetings. Now, there may be a situation where the IC may have not been able to communicate with or get in touch with PMS, or vice versa. So if that's the case and we need to raise that issue to PMS, we can. But from what I'm hearing, the communication channels have opened up tremendously. So if this is truly a challenge for our colleague here, Shavonda, then we need to figure out what the challenge is and go from there.
Great.
Um, Michelle, does the federal government have plans to extend a closeout period for subawards beyond 90 days? No, I don't think so. I don't think that, because the relationship is directly with the recipient, and they want to give them 90 days, so that that's an additional 30 days that they have to square it away with you guys, Dina. So I don't believe that that's going to be an option. I'm going to tell you that we pushed hard on 120 days, and we actually got that right for everybody. Now everybody has that option to do it. And I think that was just truly tremendous, but I don't know that we're going to get them to move. Yeah, I don't think they're going to we're going to get them to move any further on that. It says, if the FFR is submitted by 120 days, but the draw lags because we draw once a month, is the report submission not justification enough for the late draw? I think the challenge, no, it's not. I think the challenge is that the regulatory and policy requirement is 120 days. And unfortunately, these lags do happen. It's not enough justification because we have to document it if we're audited. And I'm going to talk to you about how many audits we have going on right now. So we really just need for you to document it through the justification. And then if the IC determines that that's sufficient, fine. If not, then it would be denied. So Robin says that she's also has some struggles with the communications between the IC and PMS. So this is the second time I'm seeing this. Is this the same institution? Do we know, Jim?
I don't know. I can't tell.
Okay. All right.
How about one more question on this, Michelle, because I know you have other topics you want to cover.
VCU, OHSU. Okay. Yeah, two different. So that's challenging. Okay. All right. So it would be helpful if we could have you contact our systems policy inbox and provide the case. And if it's been one time or if it's been multiple times on the same project, please indicate that, because I know that when we talk to PMS, they will tell us that they have done a lot better in terms of talking to the ICs. And if there's a challenge with that, then maybe we just need to continue to work through those challenges. And I'm not doubting that there aren't still challenges. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to move to is NIH is actually under a great deal of audit coverage, both by the OIG and by GAO. We have over 25 audits going on right now. And we are looking at trends to determine whether or not, we need to add policy updates or clarifications and that kind of thing. As you can imagine, there's just a great deal of, once the auditors come in and they start looking at the various areas, that spins into other areas. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is to manage and make sure that closeout process that we have is tight and in place and working well due to the GON Act. And it's really been a challenge for us when we are trying to issue policies and work with our recipients on various areas. And so as I was talking about, the 120 days, and someone asked the question of, isn't the time lag, justification enough? Those are the kinds of things that OIG and GAO are looking at. That, are you documenting? Is NIH documenting? Have you looked at the justification? Is the justification something that would require a policy change? If so, is it within your authority to do so? Or do you need to work with HHS on some of these areas? And I'm going to tell you that it has been a lot as we've looked at foreign interference and transparency. as we've looked at peer review conflicts, as we've looked at FCOI. We had a huge audit with the FCOI, and you saw that we modified our practices and policies there. And so for us, what we're trying to make sure of is that when we ask for the documentation, the additional documentation, and the supportive justifications, it's really not NIH, trying to place administrative burden on our recipients. We just know that the OIG is looking for that kind of thing. And we also know that there are matters where we may have to modify or update or clarify our policies and or instructions in order to meet some of these audit findings or the needs. And so I just wanted to make sure that you guys know that the goal really is for us to continue to streamline. I mean, that's just what NIH is about and has always been. But at the same time, we are seeing an uptick in audits and reviews. And so we have got to be careful in managing that and helping you guys manage as well. Because as you well know, once the OIG or the GAO looks at us, at some point it turns. And so we just want to make sure that everybody is in that safe space. And I do know too that we are looking at additional audits coming up in FY23. And I think one of the things what I would like to do in the future really is to kind of share with you guys as best I can without putting any kind of putting us at risk, but as best I can talk to you guys about some of the things that they're finding and some of the things that we need to do to tighten up as well. Because I think that that's only fair. And I also think that it protects you as well as us. But to have over 20 ongoing audits in a single fiscal year, you guys, when I tell you that we are hopping and popping, answering questions, finding, identifying policies, looking at the policies, poring over those, making sure we're answering it in a way that protects us and you, it's been a lot. And so I just want you guys to know that as we wrap up some of them, and I think it will be a good idea for us to share some of the findings and really talk through how we can best partner in making sure that we, address these together. Because whatever impacts us will impact you as well. And that's all I have, Jim.
That's great. That's really helpful to know. I think I mentioned that at the end of the discussion with the Foreign Influence Working Group that a lot of what you and NSF and DoD does is directly driven by a GAO report or a member of Congress or, the Dash 33, and in your case, any issues you have in audit, we share in those.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. Now, I do see a question and a comment here that I do want to address. Lisa Mosley rightfully says, there seems to be a significant delay in OFM approving financial reports that impacts GMS's ability to issue approval of carry forward requests. And I want to address that because that is absolutely true. And that might even be some of the delays in other areas. We have one of our colleagues, longstanding colleagues that worked in OFM, moved on to other things. And the staff is now, the workload is being redistributed and they're looking at processes and they are getting up to speed. So trust me when I tell you that OFM, the new leadership there is really trying very hard to make sure that these are addressed and they're addressed timely. And we will continue. I actually had a one-on-one with them today, and they are very committed in getting the turnaround times improved. And I'll be inviting them to talk with our Grants Management Advisory Committee so that we can help them get up to speed and looking at the various areas in order to not impact our recipients, because that is just critical. But if there's something that's really a delay and it's lagging too long, of course, you can feel free to reach out to the IC Chief GMO, or you can reach out to OPRA if it becomes systemic, and we will absolutely run interference for you guys.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. This is really good. I mean, one of the earlier themes that I heard that's great news. I know many years ago you worked at HHS, I think, right?
Yeah.
Before NIH.
Yep,
It's
I
great
did.
to hear NIH and HHS working lockstep on these critical issues, because they just don't move without you guys working together. So it's great to hear that.
That's right. It has really improved, and the DAS down there now just gets it. And we've worked. She actually, I serviced her when I was down there, so it always pays to have good relationships and maintain them, because you never know when things flip.
Right.
You want people to be able to help you, and so
Right.
she definitely is working with NIH and open to hearing everything that we talk about and all the challenges. Now, can she help us all the time? No, but she definitely is willing to listen. And if I keep coming back knocking on that door, she's like, okay, there's a problem. But I also want to send a shout out to Sarah Bible. I saw she joined our session. Hi, Sarah.
Hey, Michelle, before we leave, and we absolutely can't do this justice, but this is an issue that has been percolating on a number of fronts, and I'll mention it. And if you have some comments, great. And if you don't, we can talk about it later. And that is the issue related to, it was brought up anonymously, related to credits and rebates that show up. Sometimes these are related to procurement cards. Sometimes they're related to procurement relationships. There's lots of different things. And there's some recent discussion from the cognizants that are talking about the right way to do this is to post this back to the individual grant. And I'll say briefly, if we know what grant it's specifically related to, that's exactly what we do. But in many cases, we might get a credit back from MasterCard related to procurement spend that athletics and the health system and every department did. And there could be timing issues. There could be a million different things. And historically, we put those things into an indirect cost pool so that the feds get benefit of that through the indirect cost rate. But this idea of figuring out how many pennies, nickels, and dimes have to be allocated to every grant and every fund code is something we'd like to talk with you and other agencies about.
Okay.
Any thoughts?
So I'm gonna say I don't have any immediate thoughts, but I am going to raise it with HHS just to see, because I've had this discussion with them in the past. And one of the things we talked about was setting a dollar limit, right? And if we could get back to that place, and I know that we were going to look into it, and I actually might even talk to our CFO to see if there's something that's prohibiting HHS from approving it, because we get to that place where we talk about like $1,000 or up to $1,000, and then they back away. Then we say, well, what about $500? Can we get up to $500? And then the discussion goes, but then we don't ever see much outcome. So let me raise that back up again, Jim, and I'm adding that to my one-on-one as well. So it's the credits and rebates. I got you.
There's probably 100+ institutions on this call, and this represents thousands or tens of thousands of person hours all the time, right? Because trying to find the right code to post it to, and I don't know how in the world you'd ever determine that it withstands an audit. To me, it's a quintessential indirect cost, right? The nature of that credit or that rebate is something that you're going in indirect cost for. But I wanted to bring it up briefly, knowing that we didn't have time to fully talk about it, but just to mention it.
Well, maybe in our next session, we can think about, maybe I'll have more information, and I'll work with you, Jim, just to get some insights on what people are seeing and what they're dealing with, and the man hours that it's going into this. And is the juice really worth the squeeze here? So let's talk about that more, and I will definitely take that up for you.
That's great. So Michelle, we're going to move on to the other. So next slide, David, and everybody that posted questions in here, David Wright has been wonderful in getting us the chat. So we will follow up in the chat and follow up with these issues. Rick?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rick Fenger from the University of Washington, and I wanted to give you a quick update on our effort to work with some federal partners, NSF and Treasury, on their application of direct ledger technology on a very specific part of our process, which is the drawdown process. So This was introduced back in January, and we gave you an overview in May, and now we're at a bit of a different point in our evolution for the group. So we wanted to share where we're at and get you updated and then move on from there. So go ahead and next slide, David. Okay, so a precursor to this group and the work that they're doing is the letter of credit survey coming out of the Open Government Subcommittee. Folks have been hearing about this for years. The stats here are the 62 responses across what is now 4 systems and assessing various aspects of the process. And we have tried to hit publishing this review a couple of times over, and we have not done that quite yet. And we kind of missed the mark for this meeting as well. But the good news is, next slide, David. It's been reviewed and approved, and we're waiting for approval to release. So what that means is we've finished all of our work on formats and typos and contents and recommendations, and we're just kind of waiting to figure out how to get it out to the community. So we missed it by just a little bit, but it should be out shortly. So kudos to everybody that's worked on this over the years, just very much appreciated. Next slide, David. So the LOC feedback gets driven into the DLT conversation, which is focusing on that solid red loop there, which is, into the grants process where we're at the award management piece and people are actually looking to use their funds. So the next couple of slides are going to be around the process that we shared, and you can skip forward if you'd like. So we're honing in on this piece of the process and these areas. And when you look at the slides after the meeting, you can kind of see a little bit more around the details. But we're going to dive deeper into this section here. And go ahead, David, next slide. So we've had a couple different views of this. So the folks that are supporting us from the Fed have put together some ideas on how the process looks and works for visualization. And they mapped out our current state, and we're really looking at trying to talk about the number 2 on this slide. And next slide, David. And then that number 2 kind of looks like this when it's been reshaped with the new process and technology in place. So next slide, David. Along with those other diagrams, there's been kind of the flow where we've tried to isolate, what bits of the process actually happen in terms of activities and where those where these parts of the process are the hardest or has the most pain points. So we can go to the next slide. So you can see the pain points start getting pulled out and assessed. And then next slide, please. And the next slide. And I know I'm going fast enough to not let anybody read, but the point is not necessarily the details here, because what I wanted to show you with all of that is that for our group and the feedback that we wanted to provide, our challenge has been to really hone in on the expertise for the business process, which is what the FTP experts are bringing to the table, versus the revamp of the process and the modernization of the technology. So coming together on that conversation hasn't necessarily been about all of these details or any of these details. These details proved to be a little bit too much and maybe a little bit too technical in some cases when we're talking about tokenization and working with tokens and that sort of thing. So next slide, please, Dave. So what we're seeing, and this is the bit of the evolution, is to say that we've got a lot of volunteers in this work group. This work group has spent some time kind of getting together and talking about what the process really looks like. All of that process has been distilled into a tracking of critical steps and a bit of a parking lot where we collect some of the harder parts of the process or where some of the war stories live. And we've done that enough to where the group agrees that we've kind of landed on these 4 main areas, and we can break into small working groups now with the idea of subsets of the larger group are going to talk about these spaces in relation to the drawdown process, get into a much deeper dive and really start supplying the feedback. So next slide, David. So these groups consist of this, and this one I'll give you a little more time to read. So each group now has a title, and it has a bit of a understanding of what they're trying to tackle for these 4 segments. And then each of the groups is facilitated with a Fed representative. And then that's still supported by our critical steps in the parking lot. So really the recipient piece is the drawdown activity. A lot of folks want to gravitate towards the subrecipients part of the conversation. So it just tells me that there's challenges in the process currently that folks want to compare notes on. Then there's the administrative aspects, and then of course the reporting. And when you come to the modernization conversation around blockchain, you're talking about a lot of data that we haven't had available to us before, all being available on the blockchain and being available all the time. That could directly affect reporting in terms of what needs to be done in order to collect the information for reports, who might actually end up being responsible for reports down the line. That also certainly affects the administrative part of this as well. So there's a lot of opportunity to really improve the process just based on the data availability and transparency alone. So, and next slide. So we are in the process of shifting. We have kicked off the recipient group, and we've kicked off the subrecipient group. The admin group kicks off tomorrow, and the reporting group kicks off next week. And there's a couple of comments here just on what we've gleaned so far from these folks getting together, which is the first box there underneath recipient is really why we're getting together and what we're looking at, and what it looks like for one process to run into another. And then finding out things, and this is, for the federal folks to understand, is that really connecting information about the original grant throughout the entire lifespan of a project is pretty important. Will go a long way to making lives simpler, that sort of thing. So we expect to get more of that type of feedback surfaced and have it become a part of this overall assessment. And that will do it. I know we're a little bit behind, so I don't think we'll open up for necessarily color commentary or questions at the moment.
That's great, Rick. I really appreciate you zipping through that. And I appreciate, I know Nate's on too, but I appreciate this update. And I know between you guys and the NSF crowd and the Treasury crowd, it's really helpful what you guys are doing. So I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks.
And thank you.
Yeah,
we'll turn it over to
thanks.
Tim now. Yep.
Hi, I'm Tim Reuter. I am Senior Director of Post-Award Operations at Stanford University. I'm here to talk about the Treasury Offset Program. I've followed up on this for several months. I'll make this very quick. Basically, the Treasury Offset Program, they're the collection agency for the federal government. If you have an outstanding invoice or outstanding debt to any one of the agencies, they're required by law to send those debts to the top, the TOP, when it's 120 days overdue. Top then collects those by holding back payments to us. And most of us get paid all the time from the Bureau of Fiscal Services, who's the dispersing agency of which TOP is a part of. On our grants all the time. So we're prime targets to have our payments to us for grants to be withheld. In fiscal year 2020, they use each institution's federal employee identification number to match up those outgoing payments with outstanding debts, and that's how they match them up. In fiscal year 2020, TOP received $10.4 billion. They recovered $10.4 billion in federal and state money. So this is here to stay. Next slide.
Hey, excuse me.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to make sure, Tim, that you knew the slides were not moving.
Yep.
It was me.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay, there you go. Okay, now next slide. Thank you. Okay, if your payment is all set, TOP, you'll get a letter to your institution. The letter will tell you, hey, this agency was trying to pay you X number of dollars, but we took some of that or all of that and we used it to pay off a debt for somebody else. They'll give you the agency name, address, and telephone number to whom the payment was applied. There'll also be a TOP trace number, but that's to use by the TOP offset program to reference the agency that they gave the money to. Again, I will restate this twice. TOP does not have information on the debt. For questions on the debt, you're instructed to call the agency listed. Okay. Next slide. I just say that again, just so you know. So what you're left with is that telephone number on the letter, you have to call them, and that's not necessarily somebody, it's not necessarily a help desk there. Hey, well, I'm just waiting for you to call, Tim Reuter. This is why I withheld your money, or this is the copy of the invoice. No, it's kind of a generic number at the agency. It can take months to get a copy of whatever outstanding invoice you have that they withheld on, and it's just hard to get a hold of it. Next slide. So one of the things we did find out at the May meeting, some participants sent in information. You can go to and send a letter to the Treasury office, the G2G, government to government group here. I have their email address here, and you can request that they send you a monthly listing of all offsets to your institution. If you need to get a copy of the original letter, they will also send that letter to you. They've been great. You have to sign a release of information verification form, and they'll provide all that to you. And they at least want 2 points of contact that they can send the information to. Next slide. So one other a potential impact that can happen here with this is that an agency may withhold issuing you a new award, normally with a contract, if you are shown to have outstanding federal debt. So if that outstanding federal debt has been paid via a top offset, that specific agency that they had the money collected for, they may not have marked that debt as paid yet. So your institution is still being reported as delinquent, and the agency will not issue you an award if you still have outstanding debt. So sometimes you'll have to go back to this other agency and say, hey, wait a minute, can you get to this agency and let them know that that the debt has been paid. So those are the things you got to deal with. But again, I highly recommend you go to the G2G website, email them and get access to this. They've been great. They went back and went back several years and sent us letters that we hadn't been able to get a hold of. So that's all I got, Jim. I'm turning it back to you guys.
That's great. Thanks, Tim. You've been unofficially on point on this. Michelle, if you remember, we talked about this, I know in May, but even before that, this is like a disproportionately burdensome process that probably addresses most institutions on this call. So I'm sure we're not done talking about it, Tim, and I appreciate you continuing to provide an update. And I'd be interested if this is continues to be a big deal with many, email Michelle and myself and Tim, and we can pull a group together and, see what we can do on this. Michelle, do you have any thoughts before we move on?
No, I don't, but I do think we need to look at it, especially if it's taking up that kind of resource.
Real quick, Jim, there's one comment in here. They said that they had an issue with NOAA awards. Is this for all federal agencies? To the best of my knowledge, it's all federal agencies that are dealing with this. And the ones I've had, been Medicare issues. It's been the VA. So it runs across the gambit of all of them, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Tim, Stanford and Duke are a little bit alike in that we have academic medical centers. So if we had more time to talk about it, we would probably say that's where we tend to see it more, right? Medicare, Medicaid, and VA. But it sounds like it's not limited to just that. So again, please email Tim, Michelle, and myself, and we can continue to discuss this. Thanks, Tim. Okay, so we're really going to pick it up now because this was a session that we did a thought exchange on, and we got some great faculty input. I think Melissa Korf is on the call. I know she had a partial conflict, but I'm going to go ahead and start and move through the early stuff. Thanks, Melissa. I'm going to move through the early stuff really quick because you can go back and look at that at a later date. Next slide. So we did a thought exchange and we, again, focused just on the costing aspects. So what are these costs and who pays them and how are they paid? Does an institution pay? Does a grant pay? If an institution pays, is it in the indirect costs? Is it recoverable? When we say costing, those are the types of things that we mean, and we did a thought exchange to that end. Next slide. Very briefly, this is the data. We had 62 people that responded. and they rated 909 different thoughts, which is great. Statistically, that is lots of great input, and Melissa is going to go through some of the details. I won't go through any of the detail here, but we did track information related to type of institution, role of the individual at the institution, and the discipline, because as I think Melissa talked about in May, many of the data sharing, data storage, data issues are discipline specific. And so we wanted to try to capture, is it more one discipline or another? And again, the way Thought Exchange works is we can go in later and say, show me all the public research data related to faculty respondents that are in the natural science discipline, and we can sort it with that level of detail. We'll talk about that later, but it's really a powerful tool. Next slide. One of the questions we asked is, what are the top 3 areas of concern over on the left-hand side? Again, we discussed in May this life cycle approach of there's things that happen pre-proposal, like development of the data management plan that happens, before the proposal submitted. And then at the other end, there's things like data storage, data security, publication fees, things that are during the life of the award or after the end of the life award. Overwhelmingly, the 3 things that were pointed out, as you can see on the left-hand side, data security was a big issue. Melissa's going to talk about that. Data storage at closeout and post-closeout, and DMP, data management plan monitoring and compliance, which if you listen to NIH yesterday, that is one thing that they talked about. So it segues nicely with that. And then Michelle Masucci was really helpful in the design of these questions from a faculty perspective. And one of the questions was, how do individuals that use data sets get those data sets? And what this is identifying is data acquired through their individual activities, data acquired through purchasing the data sets, and then institutionally provided with the top 3. Next slide. So from a costing standpoint, we wanted to ask, do you know who pays for the data management? By and large, the response was the institution. And we'll get a lot more discussion on that later on. We also asked about the frequency of writing data management plans. We wanted to understand, who was answering these questions. And again, it was mostly administrators, but for the faculty, we wanted to understand, do you write data management plans and how frequently? And then we also asked about the support of the data management plans. Next slide. So as Thought Exchange does so well, is it creates word clouds. Like colors are related to like thoughts. The size of the word denotes the frequency of the issue. So as you'll see in the themes when we talk about the individual ideas, clear requirements, and understanding of budgets, and understanding of funding and costs was certainly the themes that we talk about here, which from an FDP standpoint, it makes sense. Harmony, reducing burden, and from a costing perspective, these are also those types of questions that you'd expect to show up as well. Next slide. So before I turn it over to Melissa, this is a very, very high level overview of the thoughts. Again, we had 60 or 70 thoughts. All of those thoughts were rated with 1 to 5 stars by individuals. And these were by far the most important themes. Things like, this feels like an unfunded mandate. A lot of desire for uniformity and harmonization and other things that we talk about here, and then lots of things related to costing. And I don't want to spend any more time on this because I think the next 4 or 5 slides that Melissa goes through articulates these things much better than the generic themes that I posted here. Melissa?
Thanks, Jim. Next slide, please. So I think as Jim mentioned, we really wanted to try to take a pulse on the faculty perspective as part of this thought exchange, because as administrators, we can get really into tunnel vision in terms of just our concerns and, what are we worried about paying for, and really, wanted to use this as an opportunity to refocus ourselves on like, what are the concerns of our faculty and how can we best support them in compliance with this new policy? And these some just general comments that we think kind of capture some of the feedback is that everybody really needs to understand the costs associated with DMPs, that they're real costs, and institutions typically don't have a really easy way to identify what costs are going to look like in the future. So in terms of adding those costs into a budget or anticipating what costs to comply with that data management and store and sharing plan are going to look like after an award ends, that's really difficult at the proposal stage. We really need more clear guidelines on the types of data that need to be kept and over what time frame. It's a very different animal if we're looking at keeping a small amount of data for just 3 years versus, you know, huge microscopy imaging data sets for the next 20 years. We need to provide a long-term support for disciplinary repositories that can define and curate metadata. So I think this gets at some of the infrastructure needs here, rather than having, you know, each institution pay for and create and curate its own repository. We should be looking towards pooling our resources to create these disciplinary repositories. And, you know, here's the great, you know, I think where Jim says the unfunded mandate question, right? You know, a lot of us are dealing with already being over the 26% administrative cap in our facilities and administrative rate negotiations. And so if this has to be part of F&A, if it isn't a direct cost that's added into awards, how are we going to pay for it? Next slide, please. We also looked at some of the thoughts that were added in terms of relating back to those 3 priority areas of concern. And I invite anyone that has additional thoughts, you know, jumping off of these thoughts that were shared as a thought exchange to add those in the comments, or, you know, we might even have a couple minutes for anyone that wanted to add any verbal comments. But, you know, I think that when it really comes down to on this, the concern about closeout and post-closeout data storage and management costs, I think is really captured by this last bullet on this slide. It's, you know, long-term sharing can be very expensive. When we get down to making sure that we're covering the cost of compliance with our long-term sharing and data storage obligations, will we do that at the expense of having sufficient funds to support future projects? If we're so, you know, tied up in meeting our obligations for these projects that are ended now because, you know, we already have these long-term commitments to the data, what are we not doing to meet that obligation? Next slide, please. You know, it's not just because I'm, you know, the data management, you know, DUA, you know, perspective here, but it was also notable that folks expressed concern about data security, because I think the expense of creating a model that allows us to efficiently share data when that data cannot simply be made publicly available, when we have to make sure that we're complying with HIPAA requirements, when we have to make sure that we have a DUA in place, where we have to make sure that the data is then stored, you know, at where we're trying to share it, that storage is also compliant with all of the security requirements. That can also be very expensive. You know, my institution and I think, you know, a number of our colleague institutions have also talked about, you know, compliance with requirements for FSMA standards and how expensive that can be in some of the best ways to create those secure environments are in the cloud and considering that expense. Next slide, please. I think this also gets at the cost, you know, both in terms of like cost and then the potential cost of researchers' time spent away from research in ensuring compliance with that data management plan. you know, when a researcher is writing that data management plan, do they really understand the full extent of what's required to comply with what they're putting in that? You know, do we have sufficient resources to make sure that that researcher is really able to comply with the spirit of their data management plan? Should we consider providing shared resources? You know, where can we leverage our collective need to comply with this policy and create some efficiency and cost efficiency that way? So, you know, one example then is agencies or ICs creating generic data management plans that already meet the requirements of the agency. And, you know, a researcher can just sort of more easily plug in their project specifics. And from a costing perspective, that would be hugely beneficial as well, because then we can better anticipate when we're submitting a proposal to that IC or that agency, how best to cost for compliance with their sort of standardized data management plan. Next slide, please. These aren't related to those three priority areas of concern, but I thought that they were just such thoughtful contributions and such great considerations for us to make sure we're thinking of in this space that I wanted to share them. And so the first one, my university isn't sure if they are allowed to waive F&A on cloud storage. If not, I will just purchase a server. And I think that this is an indication from a faculty member's perspective that if we can't provide them with the resources on how to make you know, data management best practices really work for them, really be cost efficient so that they still have the funds in their award budget to do the project that they need to do, they're going to make the choice that they need to make based on cost. And it may not be the choice that we or the agency may wish they would make based on current best practices. And so we really need to make sure that we're making it easy and we're making it cost effective for our researchers to comply with this policy, but also, you know, adapt to what these best practices are, where it may be more a better practice to consider something in the cloud versus the purchase of a server. And I think this other one, just going back to the presentation that we had from Taunton and Cindy yesterday afternoon regarding their implementation plans for the policy. So the focus is a big culture change. You know, a lot of the reason that NIH has decided to implement this policy is culture change. And any kind of culture change at this scale is expensive. It requires training, it requires infrastructure. And so, you know, making sure, and I think that's why, you know, Jim will, you know, show a little bit more about this life cycle approach, really making sure that we understand the full cost of the life cycle and that we're prepared to cover them. And we know who needs to cover them is really going to be critical in making sure that we're able to do what we need to do to affect this kind of cultural change. All right, I think I'll hand it back to you, Jim, to talk
Melissa.
about a little bit more of that life cycle approach.
Great, Melissa. I'm just going to do it 2 or 3 minutes, and then we're going to get to the final slide that you'll take about kind of next steps. So David has allowed us to go to 4:10. That's 5 minutes from now, but then he needs to prep for the next session. So I'm going to spend about 10 seconds on the next couple slides, which is too bad. But this slide here, those of you that are involved in costing and the F&A study will really understand how this issue is really the quintessential costing issue. There's big dollars, right? This is big dollars, as you'll see in the next slide. There's costs that could be direct or indirect. It's very complex. It could impact multiple pools. It could impact reimbursement. So this is truly what this committee is all about, and it's a very difficult problem to solve. Next slide. From a costing standpoint, this is a table from a couple of years ago that our librarian group prepared, but that just shows that for light microscopy, which is a very data intensive group, if there's 20 to 30 researchers that create 300 terabyte a year, if that data has to be maintained, for example, for 7 years, 100 terabyte could be $369,000, right? So that is not small dollars, right? If you have dozens or hundreds of faculty doing that of varying degrees, so it's big, big dollars. Next slide. This is the table we showed in May. Again, we'll provide a full-size copy of it, but when we talk about life cycle, column A is pre-proposal, all the way down through the life cycle, all the different aspects of data, all the way through to the end of the process, and going across horizontally, or who might pay. The sponsor might pay. I'm not going to touch that one because Melissa is going to talk about it a little bit later. There's different ways that the institution might pay. It could be in the indirect costs, it could be capped or uncapped, and there could be other ways. Lots more discussion. Next slide. So we talked about this yesterday. This is here for reference. We're not going to talk about this at all today. Next slide. So I'm going to kick this back to Melissa and ask her to cover this in 2 minutes so I can have 1 minute to close out. It's all yours, Melissa. Apologies.
Thanks so much, Jim. So of course, we're the FDP. So we ask ourselves, what can we do to prepare? And I think that one of the things that we've been talking about doing is potentially writing a white paper to kick the tires on some of the solutions that have been tossed around. And I think in particular, we would look for Michelle and her other agency colleagues for, advice on what they think from their perspective are their most viable solutions. And then we could pick from those to flesh out a little bit more in an eventual white paper. But one that came up a lot in the session yesterday is this, hey, could the cap on modular budgets be raised so that the costs associated with the data management and sharing can be accommodated within the direct cost budget? Another one that may, have potentially more viability is the suggestion of administrative supplements, either to cover the costs of professional data management support or other costs related to data management and sharing, or specifically, a supplement or an award at the end of a project that would cover the cost of that long-term data storage. Should we really be pursuing this idea of improved shared infrastructure? So we're not all reinventing our own wheel and paying to do it, but we're leveraging more shared infrastructure that we can share the cost of something that meets our needs, or more programs like Strides, where we're leveraging our collective purchasing power to reduce the cost. Should we be looking at a model where we're passing on the cost to the beneficiary of the shared data? And who is that beneficiary? Is it the sponsor? Or if we're sharing the data, is it the ultimate reuser of that data? So we're setting up repositories where there may be some sort of a nominal fee to access data for secondary use that helps support the repository and ensure its longevity. Or, a separate F&A cost pool. Are we moving into a space where we should be looking at F, A, and B as our costs and others? I think we're also looking at pursuing an opportunity to develop FAQs to support our faculty and administrators in budgeting for these costs, and any other resources that we might be able to provide the research administrator to help them better support their faculty in this space.
Thanks, Melissa. Next slide. That was great, Melissa. So the next 4 slides are for reference only. I did want to point this out because there is, as you can see on this slide, an NSF-funded grant. Cynthia Hudson-Vital from the Association of Research Libraries is the PI, and she's working with a number of institutions to look at some specific things. I would imagine that if there's anything, I think Cynthia's on the call, if there's anything FDP can do to help, we certainly are more than willing to do that. So more to come on that in the future. Next slide. These are data sources that if you haven't seen, you want to look at it. Next slide. This is the APARS group. Many institutions on this call probably attended this conference. There's a couple of great documents that you might reference about the broader data sharing and management issues. There's some costing aspects of it, but mostly on some of the broader issues. Next slide. There has been some NIST specific work on this called the Research Data Framework. The link is there. That really is focusing on costing aspects of that. Next slide. And next slide. So my apologies for running late. It's important to David that we kind of close it out here because he's got another session that he's got to open up. If you do have questions on any of the topics that we talked about today, Michelle and I would love to hear them, as would Rick, Melissa, Nate, and Tim. I want to thank all of them for the great presentations and the great discussion. And as always, Michelle, we appreciate your openness and support of these important issues.
Absolutely. And I'm very interested in the data management discussion. So count us in.
Yeah.
I'll assign some.
I think we need to have an off-cycle discussion on this, Michelle, right? I mean,
I agree.
yeah, I mean, this is,
I mean, 2023 is a couple of years from now. You might as well say it's tomorrow. So we need to make sure that we get, yeah,
I think this is one of the biggest issues. I mean, to me, the UG doesn't do justice in this, right? The magnitude of the culture change and the potential cost and the complexity of this is it's gonna take a different model. And so I'm hoping that we can have those discussions.
Yeah, we should. I like some of the ideas that you guys have with this expanding the strides and other things. So we should definitely engage. And hi, David Kennedy.
Thank you all. Thanks to presenters today. David, thanks for your work in doing all this. I know you've been doing this solo and we appreciate it.